in Brisbane right now, Brisbane, Australia. It's about 6 a.m. or 5:55, and it's tomorrow. So if I seem a little confused at times, that's my excuse. I appreciate very much the invitation by Book of Mormon Central Executive to be here today. And I'm especially pleased that two very good new friends of mine, Alejandro Martinez and Javier Tovar, are here today. I've got to know and love both of these men in the last few weeks down in Mexico. And I think it's great what's happening. Can you feel the energy? I can. As an old guy, I think that farms has been reborn, and we're seeing a whole new paradigm emerge. My presentation today is to tell you a little bit about the origins of the work that I've been doing in Arabia. So some of you will recognize the image on the screen. Some of you will have known and remember Ross T. Christensen, who taught for many years here at BYU. Ross and his wife Ruth were highly involved in establishing groups to focus on Book of Mormon archaeology. And I want to tell you a story that not many people know. In 1977, Ross and Ruth were volunteers at an archaeological excavation at Tel Sheba in Israel. And they had made friends with a fellow volunteer, and his name was Reverend David Hunsberger. He was a minister from Pennsylvania. As they departed and were preparing to fly back to the States, Reverend Hunsberger was trying to lighten his luggage, and he offered them a book. The book was Thorkild Hansen's book, Arabia Felix, which tells the story of the ill-fated Danish expedition to Arabia back in 1761. And it's still an excellent book, by the way. It's available in reprint, and I recommend it to anyone who wants to read a real-life adventure. So Ross, before they even left Jerusalem, began reading the book, and he came upon a map of Yemen that was prepared by a surveyor, Carsten Niebuhr, who is the only survivor of the 6-year expedition. And it shows a district called Nahum, and this is the actual map, and although it might be a little hard to see, in the red square is Nehhm. And Ross later said that it came to me immediately, I'm quoting him here, that this was the place referred to in the Book of Mormon as Nahum, where Ishmael had been buried. And that's 1 Nephi 16:34. So soon after, back in Provo, Ross mentioned this incident in the annual symposium of the Scriptures. Nothing came of it. He wrote a letter to the ensign and suggested that several things needed to be done. Firstly, there was a need to examine the Semitic roots of this name. Secondly, we needed to examine other maps and other historical references to the name to see if it could be found. And this letter appeared in the August 1978 issue. Now, back in those days, I used to read the Ensign cover to cover, and so I must have read the letter, but it made no impact on me either. And it didn't inspire anyone else to action. For 6 long years, nothing happened. But things were stirring, and over in California, Jack Welch was beginning farms, an organization destined to revolutionize Book of Mormon studies. So I've come to recognize over the years that the Lord never, ever does anything for us that we could do for ourselves, ever. Nor will he do anything for us or give us anything that is not first asked for. I've yet to see a revelation that has come from out of the blue. It always comes when we are asking for it. So that being the case, perhaps the Lord intended some learned scholar or Semiticist of the scriptures to take up the challenge that Ross gave us and the opportunity presented by this map. I don't know. But what I do know is that the Lord really had to scrape the bottom of the barrel eventually. So one morning in early 1984, I was, of course, living in Brisbane, Australia. I used the time on the bus to keep up with my reading, and that particular morning, for some reason, I took a 6-year-old copy of the Ensign with me to read. And as I reread that little letter by Ross, which you can access easily online, of course, through LDS.org, I found his comments intriguing, and something began to gnaw at me. I had already begun traveling just as a tourist, just out of interest, to the Middle East in an effort to see for myself where the events of the Bible took place. And by then I had traveled with my wife to Israel, to Iraq, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. And I'd fallen in love with the region, the color, the people, the history, the sights, and the smells. That would be familiar to many of you. So within days, the promptings continued, and I decided that I would write to the Young Farms organization. Remember, this is pre-internet, pre-email. And you still had to write a letter, put it in an envelope, and stick a stamp on it. And I wrote just asking what had been done as a follow-up to this, because I was sure it had, I just hadn't accessed the information. After all, here was a potential link to a unique Book of Mormon location, and I was staggered when a letter came back advising that in fact nothing had happened and they knew of no one pursuing the matter. So in my naivety, without any background other than my travel experience, I began to think that maybe I could go to Yemen and see what could be found. So logically, the idea was preposterous. Almost as preposterous as the idea of going to Yemen now. Not only did I have no training or expertise in the relevant fields, I could barely speak half a dozen words of Arabic. I had no money for such a trip with a young family, and that's not all. In those pre-internet days, it was almost impossible to find any information that would help you plan a trip there. And it didn't help that we were expecting another baby in 2 months. But still, the impressions continued. And when I decided to go ahead, the windows of heaven opened in terms of doors opening. For the first and only time in my life, I was offered free tickets to Cairo, Egypt. That helped solve the lack of funds. Once we got to Egypt, my wife and I, miracles began to open, and we were able to obtain visas for Yemen, which in those days was very much off the beaten track. A sympathetic man in Cairo allowed us to draw cash from our one and only credit card. Now we had money for food. And then we were able to buy tickets to fly down to Sana'a, the capital. Success didn't come easily. Despite our previous travel experience, Yemen took a lot of adjustment before we started to make some inroads. And it was not until literally the last day of the trip, the last full day, that I finally was able to locate another map that also showed the same name, Nahum. Now, at the time, to me, it seemed like that was a very small result for all the effort taken, but that one map proved to be the key to eventually tracing the name back over a period of several years through other maps and other historical references, including one from the Prophet Muhammad, to show that we could trace the name in the same location back to about 100 AD, so within about 700 years of Nephi's time. And there were many more promptings that developed from that. So after years of follow-up research, the outcome, if I could just summarize it like this, is that the first uniquely Book of Mormon location, Nahum, now has archaeological support. And the best thing you can get in archaeology is datable inscriptions. In 1997, a German government-funded archaeological team began working in Yemen near the city of Marib. Now, Marib, for those of you who know any ancient Arabian history, was the site of a huge dam that plays an important role in Arabian history, culture, in Islam. The remains of it are still there, and it's a very impressive site. And they began excavating a temple that is known informally as the Temple of the Queen of Sheba, because the Queen of Sheba, we believe, came from this area. They located an altar, which was in very good condition. That's it. Well, that's a copy, a sister altar. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. In the ruins, and with a bunch of other artifacts. This was sent on a tour of Europe entitled The Queen of Sheba. And Kent Brown, who is a professor of ancient scripture here at BYU, read about this altar in the museum catalogue, and this is in 1999. And carved around the outside of the altar, my apologies, it's a jet lag, was a text. And the rough interpretation and translation of this text mentions the name Nim, N-H-M. Now, in the Semitic languages, whether you're talking about Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, they don't use vowels, so it's all consonants. So Nahum in the Book of Mormon would be just N-H-M. And this was the name that appeared on the altar. And Kent published a small piece in the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies noting this and said this is most likely the same place, the same location that Nephi referred to and which he called Nahum. So I've spent a few minutes on this little story because I think it has some profound lessons in research methodology for all of us. First lesson for me was that windows of opportunity in Book of Mormon research may open only a little and then for very short periods. At the time, they may seem very small, inconsequential, coincidental. Think what an insignificant, innocent, innocuous beginning it had with Ross Christensen being given a book by a minister of another faith because he was worried about paying excess luggage. Think about the celestial mechanics involved in getting me to take that particular ensign to read that morning and then be open to the promptings and the blessings and the other small miracles that happened. Many of you will have read the book by Lynn and Hope Hilton called In Search of Lehi's Trail. And that describes how they were asked in 1976 by the ensign to go to the Middle East, to go to Arabia, and see what they could find out about Lehi's journey. Now, Elder Robert D. Hales, who was then an assistant to the 12, gave them a blessing before they flew out of Salt Lake. And he told them, and I quote, "A window opens sometimes only a few inches, and we need to take advantage of the light." And many of you know the story about how they arrived in Oman without a visa and managed to effectively bluff their way into the country. Oman was not admitting outsiders generally, but they were able for 24 hours to fly to the south of the country, to the regional capital Salalah, and there they saw things that they believed represented the bountiful area that Nephi describes so vividly. So they are the great pioneers of Old World Book of Mormon archaeology and geography. So I had continuing experiences in connection with Yemen and with the Nahum Altar because I began returning often. And in the year 2000, was part of a tour group, and we had around, I think from memory, it was over 30 people. We had some people here today who were on that group. And while we were there in Yemen, where it was still safe to go, this is pre-9/11, we visited the site, which was still not open to the public. And there we found a second altar, and that's the one that you see there sitting. The original altar find was still on tour in Europe. And we of course did not expect to find another altar, but there it was. And it has the exact same text carved into the limestone around the top of it. Our time was so limited, but I then returned to Yemen 2 months later and got permission from the German team to spend a period of time closely examining the altars and other finds, and located a third altar. Now this one was damaged. It was effectively in the rubbish tip where they put the damaged artifacts. But we ended up having 3 altars, basically the same design, and all having the same identical text. Now, what was exciting and significant about this is the fact that they were dated long before Brother Brown. Notice this mention of them. They were dated between 600 and 700 BC. So that puts them squarely in the Book of Mormon time frame. I began thinking, well, I'm so close to Oman, it's a neighboring country, I should go and see Bountiful, try and see what there was to see there. And that took a number of years before I was able to get a visa and go there. And so concurrently, I was visiting Yemen and Oman, and sometimes both in the same trip, exploring and finding that things were quite different sometimes from what had been reported. Now, at the time, there were actually 2 Yemens. The country was divided into 2. And the eastern part of it, which was called the South Yemen for some reason, was a strange Marxist state that didn't let anyone in. It was really quite a bizarre situation. And I needed to get to this other Yemen, but it was absolutely out of the question. So I continued exploring in Oman and in the other part of Yemen. And then, without any warning, the 2 Yemen countries, the 2 Yemen republics, suddenly went to war with each other. Now, that in itself was not too unusual there. A few thousand people were killed, and it was all over very quickly. But the greater surprise came soon after the war ended, without any warning. I think even the Yemenis were surprised. The 2 Yemens reunited. And overnight, the oil drums out in the desert that marked the border between them were rolled away, and suddenly I had access to the other Yemen. And so over a period of some 4 years, I explored 900 miles of the Arabian coast, looking to see if there were any places that came up close to what Nephi described when he described his amazing Bountiful. Any place of fertility, and I got all the way down to Aden at the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula. Now, the opportunity to go there did not last long, because not long after that, Al-Qaeda began moving in, and as you all know, Yemen today is almost basically a failed state. It's impossible to get around, even for a local. I have a couple of contacts in Sana'a. They can't even visit other parts of the capital. And so research is just out of the question. Everything has come to a halt. So the second principle that I learned from this over a period of years is that almost anyone can contribute to the great work of bringing the Book of Mormon into the light. And I'm living proof of that. I have no degrees in any of the fields that I've worked in. I had mapped out a career path that was very different from Book of Mormon research. The Book of Mormon is a history of entire civilizations over more than a millennium. And it's multifaceted and requires the talents and abilities of many, many people. So your role may be not a direct role, it may be a supportive role, perhaps supporting a spouse or a family member who is contributing in other ways. And I wonder sometimes about the wives of some of the men here today, the great pioneers, because surely their support doesn't go unnoticed where it counts the most. Okay, the third principle. Most people, sadly, are content to read about great discoveries. And what is needed much more than we've had to date is people willing to go to these places and investigate. It's not just people reluctant to leave their comfort zones. It's apathy on the part of many members when it comes to scripture study, not just the Book of Mormon. And so I learned very early on not to expect too much interest and excitement from my fellow members about anything new. I'm not talking about my own projects. I mean everything. The discovery of chiasmus, for example, and other ancient literary patterns in the book. The restoration of the original text through Royal Skousen's work. The discovery that Alma is not just a woman's name, and so on. So how many in your ward, even here in Utah, and I better throw in Idaho as well, because I know we've got a few people here. I lived in Idaho for a year, so I can speak with a little bit of authority there. How many in your ward know about Book of Mormon Central? How many know about BMAF, for example? How many bring their copy of the most correct text of the Book of Mormon each Sunday? Perhaps the question should be, how many members in your ward even know about it? And how many of us here today have a copy of the 2009 edition, which is the most correct currently? President Benson told us, as president of the church, that the Lord is displeased with our neglect of the Book of Mormon. It's supposed to be the keystone of our religion, the book that will bring us closer to Christ than any other. And that rebuke by him as the Lord's anointed prophet was one of the great turning points of our generation, I believe. As you know, Noel Reynolds has documented that neglect. And that's not to say there aren't bright sides, because we just heard about one this morning. But the neglect in many ways can be measured. And while President Benson's call directly contributed, if not led, to the great upsurge in Book of Mormon research and studies that we have today, it continues to a surprisingly large degree across the membership of the church. My own bishop, for example, back in Brisbane, bless his soul, he's a good man, he's American, he's a trained engineer. We go home teaching together, so he can keep an eye open on my orthodoxy. But he feels, and we've talked about it, he just doesn't get it. He feels that all we need to do is read the book. There's no need to study it, there's no need to analyze it, there's no need to explore. And so all of my attempts to point out how much richer and more powerful a book can be have fallen on deaf ears. So that's a challenge. The next principle, we must use the best tools available. Now, sometimes we overlook the most obvious things. Not too long ago, Kirk Magleby reminded us of the most basic tools that we should be using in our research methodology, and it's what he called the Book of Mormon Trifecta. Number one, we should have and use, when we're doing anything that involves textual studies, the 2009 Yale edition of the Book of Mormon, which is the most accurate text we have. B, we should have and use the Oxford English Dictionary, and you can get this online, so there's no need to outlay a lot of money for it. But that helps us understand the text more accurately in its early modern English, which is the language of the Book of Mormon. And 3, Google Earth. If you're doing geographical studies, Google Earth is invaluable, but not sufficient in itself. But those 3 things are the basics. And I keep coming back often to Joseph Smith's statement. He said, the truth is found by proving contraries. In other words, by comparing things, contrasting things. And that was the governing methodology in locating the old world Bountiful. This simple, obvious principle, sometimes perhaps too obvious, is a large part of how we will move this work along. Next principle, beware the enemy within. What do I mean by that? Again, I go back to something that President Benson said. None of us are perfect, and none of us are probably none of us are totally free from its effect. But the universal sin of pride manifests itself in a multitude of ways. And sadly, Book of Mormon research is not immune from it. In my time, I've seen it reveal itself time and time again. The extreme, of course, will be spoken about by Brother Stamps this afternoon, the Michigan Relics, so-called forgeries and fakes. And sadly, this particular effort was not the last in our history and probably won't be the last. Many of the leading archaeological figures in the LDS community have spoken about this. Hugh Nibley did often, and listen to some of the more recent titles that address these points. John L. Sorensen, in 1976, BYU Studies wrote an article called Instant Expertise on Book of Mormon Archaeology. Martin Reisch published a brilliant article in Sunstone in 1981, All That Glitters, Uncovering Fool's Gold in Book of Mormon Archaeology. John E. Clark, 2004, Archaeology, Relics, and Book of Mormon Belief. And more recently again, Brent Gardner's piece in 2011, Too Good to Be True, Questionable Archaeology and the Book of Mormon. And of course there are others. But despite these warnings resulting from a series of misadventures and dubious claims, and look, we get this outside of Book of Mormon archaeology as well. The secular world is rife with such events and happenings and claims in biblical archaeology. Sometimes we still succumb to amazing claims, and when that happens, the Book of Mormon's dignity and its value is instantly diminished. Sometimes the cultural Mormons and the anti-Mormons are right in their criticisms of us. So we need to be vigilant to safeguard the integrity of the Book of Mormon and the sacred work of bringing it to light. And I believe everyone here today is a part of that to some degree. The book deserves the very best that we can bring to it, not quick and spectacular showmanship. Now, based on what happened at the Bountiful site in Oman, something happened that I certainly hadn't anticipated, but I've come to learn is the desired outcome, shall we say. Once we do the work and follow the correct methodology and you locate a correct location or a correct site, even if it's just a general area, an interesting phenomenon takes place. And that is that the site or the find begins to inform the text that led you there in the first place. Now, let me give you just one brief example of many. Nephi, in describing Bountiful, talks how he would go into the mount often and pray. Now, for those of you, some of you here today have been to the prime Bountiful site, and I want to just clarify something here. There is general agreement that Kor Kafut, which is the coastal mouth of Wadi Sheikh. Now, Wadi Sheikh means river valley, if you translate it into English, is the most plausible, and in fact the only proposed Bountiful site that meets all of the criteria, the 12 criteria that Nephi has in his text. There are a couple of researchers who maintain that Kor Rory, which is about 50 kilometers north and used to be an ancient port, is a better site. So in deference to them, I say almost all researchers accept Kor Kafut as the best example of what Nephi described. But as we began exploring it over a period of years, I used to go there and camp for 2 weeks at a time and explore and try to understand what was written and what I was looking at. This phrase by Nephi, the mount, when you go there, you see a single mount. Now, the whole area is embraced by mountains, but there is a peak there that is the obvious candidate. And what was interesting was that as you then accept that this is the obvious candidate for the mount, you then see other things in the text and they begin to make sense. So we should expect that eventually something like that will happen in New World Studies, but first we have to follow the correct methodology. Does that mean 5 minutes? Oh, okay. I thought I was being given a warning. So just to summarize, the methodology that has worked with finding Nahum and with finding a completely plausible, bountiful site is, number one, we need to first mine the text. And on that note, when I began examining First Nephi, I think I was staggered, and I think a number of other people are. The church today uses that list of criteria in its teaching materials in the CES. There can be a staggering amount of information in a small number of words. Number two is that we then have to do extensive research in all aspects. And number three, and of course that would include Google Earth where applicable. Number three, you must have real world exploration. You cannot substitute that. You must go there, see the lay of the land. You must go there and see the features that are being described. Because these men were inspired by God. They had common sense. They knew that they were not going to return. And so they built into the text enough detail that it's been left for us. I often wondered, well, why did Nephi mention the name of the place where his father-in-law was buried? It was clearly done not to impress anyone, but simply to place it on record. Now, in the time remaining, I just want to mention a specific issue that many of you might be aware of, and that is that the possibility that traces of a sacred sanctuary, a holy place, may have been found at Kafut. Now, this is all very tentative. But if it proved to be the case, it would be a development on par with the Nahum Altars. And since I'm the person to blame for this development, I want to try and exonerate myself and give you the background to it. Okay, by way of background, this is a reconstruction of the Jerusalem temple that Lehi and his family were familiar with. It played a part in their daily life as observant Israelites. That's the interior. Now, this style is known by archaeologists, biblical archaeologists today, as the long room design. And you can see why. It's essentially a long rectangular room. And what's interesting about this is that it wasn't Solomon's temple was not the first. It actually mirrored the much earlier tabernacle. And many of you here today will have seen the life-size reconstruction at Timnah in Israel. This is built very, very accurately. It's very impressive to visit and see the background to this. But it's a life-size reconstruction of the tabernacle. This is what it looked like, as close as we can come. And so the tabernacle follows the same long room design. Not only that, but even other temples and other sacred places and even non-Israelite structures dating back to that period follow the same design. Here's the reconstruction of the temple at Tel Arad. Some of you may have also visited. Here's the Elephantine temple down in Egypt. You notice the dating there, but notice also the style of the floor plan. Okay, so we have Solomon's temple floor plan on the left and the Ain Dara temple, which is yet another one, Israelite temple, on the right. So we can trace the descent of this pattern back to the tabernacle. After leaving Jerusalem, Lehi and Sariah's group, as you know, spent 8 years in the wilderness. Now, most scholars, I believe, now accept that includes the time that they had at Bountiful, which was surely several years. So when you take that 8 years and then add on to it an ocean voyage of at least a year to the New World, there was an interval of roughly a decade between the time that they left Jerusalem and the time that Nephi erected a temple in the New World. And what do we read in the second Nephi 5? We read that the new temple that Nephi built in the Americas was modeled after Solomon's temple. Obviously not the same size, but still followed the same style. So Nephi didn't innovate. He followed the pattern. So even in the New World, they kept following this style of building. Now, remember that initially, when they left Jerusalem, they did not know, I believe, it's not evident in the text, they did not know that this was really just the starting point of a longer journey, and perhaps none of them would have left if they had known. I suspect many of them expected that they were leaving a temporary escape into the desert until things cooled down. Now, this is an image of the western plateau at Khor-Khafut in Oman. This is the Bountiful site that I've been referring to. The western plateau lies directly at the base of the most obvious candidate for Nephi's mount. So if you were looking a little bit further to the right, you would see the rest of the mount. And this is taken in the dry season when the vegetation is all burnt back, and it makes it clearer in seeing the ruins. Some of the ruins at Khor-Khafut are understood, others are not. But what's of interest, I believe, is that the oldest ones appear to be on the western side, on this little plateau. When you're actually there, it's quite large. But it would have been larger 2,600 years ago because of the erosion of the cliffs. So I've poked around these structures since 1988, and in 1993, I was there and we had a team of people, and we began to focus on one particular structure which is built up against a large monolithic rock. And I had my son Chad, who was on his first ever visit there, sketch it. And this was without any background information on my part or on his about the long room design. So what do you notice about the design? Could it be the long room design, or is that just a coincidence? Now, that is a view taken on the Western Plateau. The large rock is in the center below, at the bottom of the frame, and in front of it are the remains of the structure. So back in the early 90s, I showed the plan that my son had done and some photos to an LDS archaeologist here in Utah who specialized in the Iron Age period of the Old World, which is Nephi's and Lehi's period. And he immediately became excited and thought, yes, it could well be an Israelite structure. So for several years, I did the obvious thing, tried to get him to come to Oman and see it for himself. I even found funding for him at one point, but for a variety of reasons, it never happened. So I arranged for other archaeologists to go. All of them were non-LDS, but I didn't highlight this particular structure. But without expertise in Israelite archaeology, none of them saw it as unusual or significant. And then we had a development in 2014 where we had a team that had 4 professional archaeologists on it. 3 of them were not LDS, and once again did not see anything particularly significant about this structure. But one of them was LDS, and he's here with us today, Rick Hauk, who many of you will know. He also saw the structure, and after seeing Chad's sketch of it, became excited, and he now leads a project to try and discover what can be known with some degree of certainty about the structure. So that's roughly where we're at now. I don't know how long it's going to take to come to any sort of conclusion on this, but it promises to be an interesting adventure, and we should all stay tuned. The old world setting of the Book of Mormon, the land of Jerusalem and Arabia, has emerged from obscurity rather spectacularly in the last few decades. Now that began, of course, with Hugh Nibley's writings in the 1950s, but they continue today. Now, placing Nephi's account on the modern map has been fundamental in allowing some of the subtleties in the text to emerge. We now know where Nahum was, and still is today, and that has become the first unequivocal archaeological support for a unique Book of Mormon location. We now have a candidate for Bountiful that fully meets Nephi's description, and we know that there are no other viable candidates. I would like to thank Book of Mormon Central for this opportunity. If there are any questions or comments anyone would like to make. The inscriptions on the Nahum altars actually give the names of certain individuals who are already known through a variety of other methods. For example, like a king list will have, so-and-so, and then he ruled, and then he ruled. And so the names, it's locked in. I went and sent a copy of the inscription to Dr. Kenneth Kitchen in London, and he's recognized as one of the top 3 or 4 people who have expertise in that area, and he gave us the best translation and transliteration of the text. And what was interesting was that later on, the dating of the altars, of the 3 altars, and no other artifacts from the site was actually moved to a century earlier. And if you think about it, Nahum was a place that already had that name. The way that Nephi writes about it, he says that Ishmael was buried in the place which was called Nahum. And so you have to be looking for something that dates back to pre-600 BC. And it's just worked out beautifully in terms of that. It's the one area, along with chiasmus, I think, that the enemies of the Book of Mormon have the most difficulty, because if any of you have followed Jeff Lindsay's series of articles on Nahum in his excellent blog, you'll see how weak the arguments are against it. I mean, some of them are truly laughable. And that's the best that they can bring against it. So I hope that answers the question. Lady there? Well, I think the assumption is that for all of those years, not having access to the temple as a place where sacred ordinances could be performed, sacrifices could be offered up, they would have built or developed some kind of a sacred structure. And so the best case scenario would be that they built this as exactly that, to serve them while they were at Bountiful. When they arrived at Bountiful, they may well have expected this was the end of the journey. I mean, if you spend enough time traveling across the Arabian desert and arrive at this place, thank you, the contrast is extreme. And some of you here today have been there. It's beautiful, it's lush, it has large timber trees, it has wild fruit growing, it has honey, and yet no one lives there today. And of course, that's another interesting thing. As Nibley said, you have to buy the book and read it to understand why. But it's possibly the remains of a structure that they built. There again, it may not be. I don't want to come across as saying it is, and we're just waiting for the announcement. Okay, I've been given some questions. Okay, here's an interesting one. When you stand in these places, do you feel anything? Yes. Ticks, mosquitoes. Sunburn. Just last week, on my last morning in Mexico, I picked off the last tick from my body in a most embarrassing place. But Scott Proctor tells the story about how he and his wife, Maureen, were there, and what was the count, the tick count at the end? Yeah, I thought it was something like that, and that was just on your legs. Yeah. Okay. To be serious, and I want to give this the seriousness that it deserves. I have never, to this day, sought a spiritual confirmation that the place that I was at was such and such a place. And that includes visits that I've had to the Holy Land. I've been in Golgotha, I've been in the Garden Tomb, Mount of Olives, the whole bit, the River Jordan. I have never asked for a confirmation. But impressions have certainly come. And I have seen too many instances where people have said, the Spirit bore witness to me that this is the place, or this was such and such. And later we find that they weren't. And maybe it's a reflection also of my own lack of confidence. But I have never done that. But yes, it's exciting to be there in these places that are potentially sacred and important places. And in some cases, yes, that impression has come, yes, this is the place. But I've never put that in my books. I've never put that in anything I've written.